This episode is brought to you by Schiit Audio, manufacturers of sanely priced DACs, amplifiers, preamplifiers, and EQ devices. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
Last week we made a video about the Dynaudio Focus 30 loudspeakers. They're now over there. But today I want to respond to some of the comments in that Dynaudio video. I was very pleased with the reaction really actually, because it did 60,000 views in about 4 days, which is pretty damn good. The response was good comments wise, and I've screen grabbed 10 comments here. I've put them into a Google Doc on my iPad. Let's tackle them. Now the first one is a whatabouter. It comes from Mark Begine, and he asks, what about Qobuz? Because I said that only Tidal was integrated inside the Dynaudio app. Well, if you want to use Qobuz, Mark, you either have to use AirPlay or you have to use Google Chromecast, depending on what kind of phone you have. You could use Bluetooth, but that won't sound as good as using AirPlay or Chromecast. So it's quite a simple solution, really. I don't think anybody needs to kind of get bent out of shape about it too much that Qobuz isn't built into the Dynaudio app. I mean, you could also integrate Qobuz in Roon. To be honest, if you're spending $7 on a pair of active loudspeakers that also do streaming, I would recommend at least paying €10 a month for Roon as well to really tie the whole thing together. But that's me. Like, you might not feel that way, so you could just use AirPlay or Chromecast. The difference between AirPlay and Chromecast, two things. The stream travels through the phone with AirPlay. It doesn't with Chromecast. But with Chromecast, you don't get gapless playback. Next comment comes from a chap, I assume it's a chap, called RJ. They're generally all dudes on my channel. I do look at my stats. It's a lot better than it used to be. It used to be like 0.001% female. But now it's like 2% female, so I'm very happy about that, obviously. But yeah, audiophile world is still a massive dude fest. Anyway, RJ asks or says, hi John, great video and thanks. You're welcome. I assume since you didn't mention it, that there was no problem with gapless playback with the streaming functionality of the Focus 30s. Correct? Thank you for all you do. No, there was no problem with gapless playback, because if there were, I would have put it in the video. I would have mentioned it. You know me, I would have mentioned that, right? So streaming is done either using AirPlay, which we've already said is gapless. We could use Chromecast, that is gapped, so there's no gapless there. We could use Roon, which is gapless. We could use Tidal Connect, which is also gapless. We could use Spotify Connect, also gapless. Bluetooth, inherently gapless. So the gapless playback, when I generally mention it, usually relates to the app, the manufacturer supplied app, or if it's an app I haven't used before. I didn't test Tidal inside the Dynaudio app for gapless playback because you got Tidal Connect. Why would you use it? I just don't see the point. That brings us to our next question from, I've got to get his name right here, John Pichetta. And he writes, hey John, encouraging that you stuck with the Wi-Fi connection between the speakers and didn't resort to the coaxial connection. Was there or were there any dropouts or audible differences between using both? I love the versatility this system offers. Thanks again. Two reasons really I didn't go for the wired connection. I don't have a coax cable long enough. Secondly, I didn't feel the need. So because I didn't do that, I have no idea if there's an audible difference. I do know that you can get 24.192 between the speakers if you go hardwired, but as somebody who's not into high res at all, I just don't care. And I'd much rather have one less cable and have the the WISA between the speakers. Audible dropouts, were there any? Oh, again, if there had have been, I would have mentioned it in the video. Let's move on to John Creech. Another John here. He asks, John, how did or do you know that that's a good pressing without having taken it out of the wrapper? Now, John is referring to the Bowie album that I held up, the Buddha of Suburbia. And I apologise to Olaf for not having taken the polythene wrap off the front. The reason I know it's a good pressing is because I had already opened it, but generally what I do when a record arrives is I just get my little knife and just make a cut down where the records come out of the sleeve, which keeps the polythene wrapper in place. I don't know why I kind of want to keep that in place for as long as possible, because I take it off eventually, ultimately. But generally, I guess it maybe enhances the feeling of newness. So a lot of my records are opened, but yeah, the wrapper hasn't been completely taken off. Next question. This is a really good one, actually. This comes from Niels Christensen. And he writes, I believe there was a firmware update within the last week or so, adjusting the voicing of the speakers, among others. Was this change included in your conclusions? Yes, it was, because I waited for that update to come about before I conducted my review, because Dynaudio told me that it was coming, that it would change the sound of the speakers a little bit. So I didn't really listen to them beforehand, but I did afterwards. Actually, the update came about, I think it was about 3 or 4 weeks ago, not at the last week. It was a bit further back than that. Next question comes from Bitter and Jaded. What a great name that is. Do you know of anyone ever making a tube-based active speaker? I suppose microphonic issues with tubes would prevent it. How about actives with outboard amplification? I suppose that would reduce the one box minimalist aesthetic considerably, but still not attract the unapologetic tweakers. Actually, there is an active speaker with a tube in it, and it is made by Darko.Audio. And even more coincidentally, my buddy Michael Livornia in New Jersey has just reviewed that speaker for his website, Twittering Machines. But I'll put a link in the description box below if you want to read about an active loudspeaker with a tube that sits like in this sort of cavity that sits below a driver. It's pretty cool. Next question comes from Mark Price. John, you've previously mentioned that you tend to prefer stand mount speakers for your space. After reviewing a few active Floorstanders recently, has your opinion changed? This is a great question. I mean, it's not really related to the Dynaudio so much, but it is a good question. I still prefer stand mounts, if I'm honest, and I'll tell you why. It's because, yes, integrating a sub is much more of a pain in the butt than just plonking a pair of Floorstanders down. But the thing about a Floorstander is the position of the bass, left and right speakers, is fixed. You can't move it around the room. Subwoofer, you can move around the room. And you can also attenuate how much bass you're sort of putting into the room with the controls on the sub. And typically with most Floorstanders, especially passive, you can't do that. I mean, yes, the Dynaudios have the benefit of Dirac room correction, so they're a little bit of an exception. But this is a general question about my attitude generally towards Floorstanders and towards stand mounts. Now I've got the Bookharts here. I think they have a lot more sort of low-end wallop than the Dynaudios, but they don't seem to be troubling the room that much. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe it's the implementation. We'll have to dig into it when we come into master tunings. But yeah, generally speaking, I'm still a stand mounts kind of person. And maybe that's just because I've always been a stand mounts kind of person. Maybe it's just hard to shake off that sort of preference, or some people might call it a bias. Yeah, sure. But I just call it a preference. I prefer stand mounts. Also for storage, right? Because storage of Floorstanders, I've got 3 pairs in here right now dotted about. The boxes, the packaging, it's enormous. It lives in my cellar. If I didn't have a cellar, I would be screwed. I wouldn't be able to do Floorstanders at all. Whereas a stand mount box is, much smaller, much easier to store and manage. So that's another reason for me to put a tick in the stand mount column. Another question. This one comes from Brian Toozy. And he asks, hi John, is there a danger with so many DSP filter options that you can spend more time playing with the app rather than listening to the music? Yeah, there is. But the way I see it is this, right? Is that Dirac's sort of flexibility in being able to sort of mold the target curve, experiment with different target curves, is it gives the tweakers something to do. Because anybody moving from a sort of more traditional separate loudspeaker system with passive speakers. They can change things in and out, different power supplies, different this, different that. It's the tweakability that people enjoy, or some people enjoy. Now with a pair of Dynaudios, a streaming active loudspeaker with all the electronics inside the speaker, there ain't a lot to play with if you're a tweaker. But Dirac and its target curve flexibility gives you some of that tweakability back. Okay, now this one, this comes from Woody O'Neill, and he writes, disagree. This is the future if you want a single point of failure future. If one speaker dies, the other dies along with the amp, DAC, etc. Smiley face. And this led actually to quite an interesting discussion between a few of us in my comments. It was pretty cool actually. Everybody kept their heads. And I think really where I come at this, right, because this sort of single point of failure, yeah, in an active speaker, you've got all the electronics inside there. So if the amp module dies, your ability to play music goes with it, right? You can't do it anymore. But isn't that the same with a passive loudspeaker system? If you've got passive speakers, outboard amp, outboard DAC, outboard streamer, if any one of those components dies, you can't play music anymore. Now you might say, well, okay, well, if my outboard amp dies, all I've got to do is send that back to the dealer or the distributor or the manufacturer. So then the conversation really moves to how big and heavy is the box that you have to send back. It's not about where the point of failure is from my point of view. It's really like, yeah, how awkward it is to get it repaired. So in the case of the Dynaudios, you'd have to ship one speaker back, probably both, but maybe you'd get away with one, I don't know. Some people have very large amplifiers, so if they need repairing, that's going to be a very heavy box that needs to go back. But again, this brings us back to stand mount loudspeakers, right? If you've got active stand mounts, and let's say the amplifier module dies in those, the box that you have to send back isn't really going to be all that much larger or heavier than if you've got a fairly substantial integrated amplifier. I'm thinking of something like the Hagel H590, which this week became Roon Ready. If that dies and it has to go back to be repaired, that's probably going to be a heavier box than most active stand mount loudspeakers, I would think, because that thing's a beast. So it's not where the point of failure is. I think it's just more about what you have to do to get it repaired. And some people might say, well, I've got a spare amplifier on hand that I can just slot into my passive system. But I would say, well, I've got a spare pair of streaming active loudspeakers that I can just slot into my lounge room while the other thing's being repaired. So it's really about the size and the hassle of the box, I think. Last question actually comes from Aman Kawa. And he writes, I know you didn't do this comparison, but if you had to venture a guess from a pure sound quality standpoint, ignoring convenience, simplicity, etc., would these Dynaudios play as well as a similarly priced separate passive system? Now this is where we, where the rubber meets the road, isn't it? Because a lot of people in the comments, I think, what's really trying to downplay, or maybe just aren't aware of the advantages of having an active crossover done in DSP. I spoke with Paul Barton of PSB Loudspeakers yesterday. I asked him this very question, and he said, yeah, pretty much that's true. That you can really dial in the smaller stuff with the DSP that you can't go near with a passive crossover. So the reason I mention this is because basically, for the same money, generally speaking, the active system will sound better than the passive system. And I can already hear the roars of disapproval in the audience from my saying that. But if you speak to a loudspeaker engineer about this, I mean, I know that the guys at KEF have told me this. The guys at Qobuz have told me this. The guys at Dutch & Dutch have told me this. Active speakers, all other things being equal, including price, will generally give you a better audible result than a passive system. But hey, if you can think of a passive loudspeaker system, so passive loudspeakers, outboard amplifier, outboard DAC, outboard streamer, and you have to name all four components, and you have to have heard it compared to the Dynaudio Focus 30. This is important. It's not a matter of I think this might be better. It's I know. So if you've done this comparison, please let us know in the comments below. please, no sort of postulating here, because that's not the same thing, right? If you've got a passive system, 4 separate components, and you've compared it to the Focus 30, I would love to hear from you, to hear what you found out, because that would be interesting. I think for all of us, we can all learn something, right? Anyway, I've got a bonus comment here because I thought it was kind of funny to end with. Annan writes, every time I watch your videos, my budgie goes into a talking competition with you. I don't know why, but I love it. And I asked what the budgie's name is, and apparently it's Kukuk. So, hello Kukuk. Who's a pretty boy then? Anyway, I hope you found this video a little bit useful as a follow-up to my review video. If you did, please consider giving this video a like down below if you like my attitude towards my videos really, and engaging with the comments more. If you dig that, please consider subscribing to this channel. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.